So when the topic of WikiLeaks and journalism came up, the first thought I had was Harry Browne, and it's great to have him here tonight. Harry is a journalist and lecturer, and also the author of two good books on the pit stop ploughshares and also on Bono. So Harry Browne.
Kieran's joke was that he had lots of other people lined up to speak instead of me, but he said, "Harry, would you be on the bench in case all of these people?" He didn't tell me that I was going to have to follow Imogen Gunnar, or honest to God, I hear just the pure ugliness of my voice compared to the tone of your fiddle. Oh my God, it's just. I was on my feet lecturing for a while today, and I gave blood this evening as well, and I've been trying to replace the blood with alcohol since then. And I'm saying that not to kind of like flaunt any virtue or anything like that. The idea of coming and flaunting virtue in a room with people who've done time and are facing courts and we're in solidarity with someone who's been, illegally detained for several years. By no means am I doing that. It's just that I might fall down at some point. And if I'm going to get the 10 minutes that Kieran wants me to do here, you might have to ask me a few questions to kind of keep my mind turning over and rolling.
Just follow in that direction.
Okay. It's a deal. So whose guitar is that?
Would you like a seat?
I would love a sweet, actually.
Seed?
A seed? No, I don't need a seed. Oh no, has anybody got a sweet? Now I need a sweet. Okay, no, I'm fine, thank you. I do this for a living. So speaking of doing this for a living, I'm here because I'm a journalist and I'm a lecturer in journalism, and I have done stories that I owe to Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, insofar as they were based. Look, sweets. Or dates. Fantastic. That's great.
The nicest sweets.
Nice, the nicest. Thank you so much. That's great. Thanks. Thank you. No, thanks. So the relationship between what Assange and WikiLeaks does and journalism as a kind of practice, as a profession, as an institution or series of institutions is something that I think people are kind of interested in and is worth discussing and exploring a bit. There was about 6 or 7 years ago, a documentary came out about the New York Times. It was kind of a fly-on-the-wall insider documentary called Page One Inside the New York. This is very nice. Every minute or so, someone has to come forward with some form of sugar to keep it going. And in this documentary, which was, as I say, a kind of fly-on-the-wall documentary inside the New York Times, it so happened they were there in the period when that paper partnered with WikiLeaks and did some of the revelations around the Iraq war logs that Chelsea Manning had. Of course, we now know Chelsea Manning had been the source for WikiLeaks on those. And there's a scene in the film where these twerpy New York Times journalists are agonizing about what precisely their relationship with Assange and WikiLeaks constitutes. Because Assange says we're partners, but we're not really partners, are we? He's not like us, is he? No. He's a source. He's just a source. We just deal with Assange and WikiLeaks like we do with sources. We're journalists doing the journalism, and we don't have to worry about whether Assange is in our category. He's in this other category, this important category, but different category called source. And to some extent, you could possibly argue that WikiLeaks had invited that by going to the New York Times and saying, "Can we work with you to do these stories?" But the fact is that there's, and as the quote there says, quite simply, our motive is identical to that claimed by the New York Times, the Washington Post, to publish newsworthy content. WikiLeaks is a publisher, a gatherer, disseminator, evaluator of newsworthy content. WikiLeaks does journalism. WikiLeaks has been doing journalism from the start. In fact, when I first heard of WikiLeaks, when I first knew that I'd heard of WikiLeaks around, I guess, 2008, 2009, when people were talking about it first, I thought, that name, it's familiar. I know that name from somewhere. And I actually searched my inbox, my Gmail inbox, terribly insecure mode of communicating, and I had an email there from J.A. inviting me to join WikiLeaks in 2007 or 2006 or 7 when it was just beginning, because he wanted journalists involved in WikiLeaks who would help to evaluate and disseminate the information that they hoped they would be gathering through this world of leaks that they were wanting to generate. So I know that WikiLeaks had a journalistic intent, because I had actually completely missed the email, or it had kind of gone over my head, and I found it 2 years later. Shows what a good journalist I am. But the fact is, they were looking to do journalism from the start. They were looking to gather, evaluate, disseminate newsworthy information. There's no way that you can separate, and particularly in 2018, but the New York Times torps were trying to do it in 2010, 11. There's no way you can separate what WikiLeaks sets out to do from what journalists do. Journalists at their best, and journalists not at their best. And I guess that kind of brings up another question, which is maybe or maybe not relevant to this act of solidarity that we're doing, but might be interesting anyway. Is it good journalism? Is what WikiLeaks does good journalism, important journalism? And I think by any of the measures within or without the profession or the practice of journalism, of course it is. It's obviously good journalism. It has brought forth impactful stories, global intelligence files, the collateral murder video, and the information about NSA targets, all of those extraordinary diplomatic cables, including the ones from Ireland that tell us the extent to which the US Embassy here was shitting itself about what the pit stop ploughshares had done. So absolutely valuable information, stories that allow us to know more about the world that we live in. So good journalism in that respect. Good journalism in the sense that it got a lot of attention. So good journalism from the point of view of, the industry, if you like. It was good enough journalism that all of the New York Times and the Guardian and here the Irish Independent wanted the stories. So good journalism in that sense too. So yeah, good journalism. Ethically good journalism, I think by and large, yes. From the beginning, WikiLeaks was concerned to ensure the safety of its sources and the safety of anybody who might be affected by the stories. And WikiLeaks had it very much built into its DNA that redacting stories, carefully evaluating information, not just dumping information, was an important part of the project. That did change to some extent over the years, and it changed largely because of the situation in which Assange finds himself and the extent to which mainstream media cast him aside. But I think that we can certainly say that, ethically good journalism in that sense. And then there's some of the latest things that we've learned about the way Assange, to some extent, attempted to conspire with Donald Trump Jr. in relation to trying to get the Trump camp to leak information to WikiLeaks about, for instance, Donald Trump's tax returns, and have it go into the public domain through WikiLeaks without people knowing that it was a deliberate leak in order to benefit the Trump campaign. Is that good? Well, all the journalists around the world who are, they remind me of sort of Claude Rains in Casablanca. Shocked that a journalist would conspire with a potential source to ensure that they got a story, and that story got out in a way that the source would be happy with and would benefit them, and that the trail back to that source would be hidden. Journalists do that every single day. Every single day. And to the extent that Donald Trump is involved, we go, God, that's awful. But to the extent that Assange was working with a potential source and trying to flatter them and hope that they could get information, he was doing what journalists do. I wouldn't fancy doing it myself, but I can't say, and I don't think any journalist can honestly say, that's beyond the bounds of good journalism to act in that way. But in any case, that's kind of a journalism lecture. That's a lecture about, that's something for media studies students to consider. Should it affect our solidarity with him? It shouldn't. Does it affect people's solidarity with him? Is it something that, that Twitter storms build up about and people say, oh, well, I liked Assange before, but I don't know about this stuff? Yeah, of course it is. Because we have this kind of stupid notion that solidarity is about finding a paragon of virtue, putting that paragon of virtue up on a pedestal, and offering our sort of devotion to that person or that nation or that people or that political system or whatever. And of course it's not. Of course it's not. We're in solidarity with Julian Assange. I'm in solidarity with him personally because I think he's a journalist. I think he's a good journalist. I think he's in trouble for his journalism, and you know, and I've got stories from the journalism that he's done, and on that level, I owe him one, and I will stand in solidarity for that reason. But the rest of us, the rest of you who don't necessarily have that particular relationship with Julian Assange, should still be in solidarity with him because he is a victim of American imperialism. His journalism is journalism that has attempted to expose the crimes of American imperialism in the world. And the status in which he finds himself, this illegal detention, and the risk that he faces of a long prison sentence if they get him into Guantanamo or an American court, are precisely because of the nature of what he's exposed and the enemies that he's made with that exposure. So I don't have a problem with saying, I wish Julian Assange hadn't conspired with Donald Trump. I also don't have a problem with saying, Jesus Christ, he's been 5 years in the Ecuadorian embassy. Wouldn't you do anything to try to get out of that situation and talk to whoever might help you in that situation? And I also don't have a problem with saying, however you evaluate that, it doesn't really matter. Julian Assange is our comrade because of the enemies that he's got and the threat that those enemies have hanging over his head. So whatever you think of him personally and whatever you think of the actions of WikiLeaks, historically, journalistically, politically, and in the context of the American election of 2016, which everybody seems to still think is going on, and we still have to kind of argue about and argue about and argue about as though it were the current political battle, which is kind of pathetic in its own way. Whatever you think of that, Julian Assange is in trouble. He's in trouble because he stood up to exactly the people that we should be standing up to. Exactly the people that most journalists don't bother standing up to most of the time. And for that reason, I have no problem standing here in 100% solidarity with Julian Assange.